The night I gave birth, I was lying flat on my back in a cornfield, biting down on a dried husk so no one would hear me scream, and the only witness to any of it was the August moon hanging low and indifferent above Lancaster County. I was 14 years old. I had been hiding my pregnancy for 7 months, a pat. From my father, from my mother, from the bishops, from every woman at every Sunday singing who looked at me a half-second too long before glancing away. By the time my body finally forced the matter, I had run out of places to hide except that cornfield, the one behind our barn, the one that swallowed you whole the moment you stepped between the rows. I had been planning it for weeks in the back of my mind, the way a person plans for something they pray will never come. I would slip out at night, I would go to the corn, and whatever happened, no one would ever know. That was my plan. It was a child's plan. I was a child. It started at 11:30, a tightening low in my belly that I had felt before, in smaller ways, but never like this. Never like something inside me had decided it was finished waiting. I lay in my bed for 20 minutes, counting the gaps between the pains. And when they dropped to every 5 minutes, I knew. I pulled my shawl off the hook. I tucked my feet into my boots without lacing them, and I walked out the back door into the dark. The field was maybe 150 yards from the house. By the time I reached the first row of stalks, I had to stop and breathe through a contraction with both hands pressed to my knees. And I remember thinking very clearly that if I died out here, they would find me in the morning and finally understand everything I had refused to say out loud. I walked deeper in until the house lights disappeared, and the only sound was the dry rustling of the stalks and the far-off whistle of a freight train. I spread my shawl in the dirt between 2 rows, and I lay down. I want you to understand what that means. To lie down in cold August dirt with no one beside you and no one coming. To push a baby into the world using only instinct and terror. Because that is exactly what I did. I did not know how to push. I did not know anything. I had never been told what birth looked like, what it felt like, what the body does when it has no choice. My mother had never spoken of it. The women in our district whispered about things like that the way they whispered about everything, just enough to confirm it happened, never enough to actually prepare you. So I pushed because my body demanded it, and I screamed into that corn husk, and I pushed again, and on the third great heave, I felt something slip free of me, something warm and slick and terrifyingly still, and I reached down with shaking hands and lifted her up. She was a girl. She was gray. She was not moving. I held her against my chest, and I rocked and I whispered, "Please, please, please," the only prayer I had left. And after several long seconds that I cannot fully account for, she made a sound, not a cry, not yet, just a small wet gasp, like a door opening. And then she screamed, a thin, clear note that cut straight through the corn and the dark and the distance. And I pressed my hand over her mouth out of pure fear, not knowing that cry had already traveled, already reached the road, already reached the ears of the one person in Lancaster County who would know exactly what she was hearing. Her name was Rebecca. She was our district's midwife, 60-something years old, with a leather bag she carried everywhere, and a face that had seen enough of life's worst hours to have stopped flinching at them entirely. She had been walking home from a long birth across the county when she heard my daughter cry, and she told me later, much later, that she had followed that sound the way you follow a lantern, instinctively, without deciding to. I did not hear her coming. I only heard the stalks shift, And then she was beside me, kneeling in the dirt in her dark dress, already opening her bag, already speaking in a low, calm voice that I want to say I found comforting, but mostly I found it terrifying because it meant someone new. She cut the cord, she cleaned the baby, she listened to the tiny heartbeat with her ear pressed flat to that fragile chest. She said, "She is strong." She said, "You did well." She did not say what she must have been thinking, which was that I was 14 years old and bleeding in a cornfield, and this situation was well beyond the boundaries of what she was equipped to manage alone. What I did not know then, what I could not have known, was that Rebecca had a history that made this moment almost unbearably personal for her. She told me as she worked, in short, quiet sentences, that she had been born in a situation not entirely unlike the one I was in now. Her own mother had been 15, unmarried, frightened, hidden. A midwife had found her mother too, in a different field, a different county, a different century almost. And that midwife had sworn silence and had carried the secret to her death. Rebecca said she had spent her whole life trying to understand what she owed to that chain of women, the ones who hid, the ones who found, the ones who kept quiet. Now let me tell you about the boy, because this story does not make sense without him, and I am tired of keeping his part of it tidy. His name was Ezra. He was 17 when I was 12, and he was 19 when I was 13, and he had been a fixture of our district's edge since his family moved from Ohio, when I was still young enough to think nothing of an older boy paying me attention. He was charming in the way that certain kinds of danger are charming. He brought things, small gifts, a carved wooden bird, a handful of wildflowers left on the fence post. He remembered things I said weeks after I said them. He made me feel, at 13 years old and starved for any form of being seen, as though I was the most important person in any room he entered. I did not know that what he was doing had a name. I did not know that I was being prepared rather than courted. I did not know that all those small attentions were not affection but architecture, that he was building something, I had no idea I was standing inside of, until the night he led me to the back room of his father's workshop under the pretext of showing me a lantern he had made, and locked the door behind us. Afterward, he told me I had made him do it. He said I was too forward, too bright-eyed, too obvious in the way I looked at him. He said that any man would have done the same. I was 13 years old. I believed him. I believed him for months after, even as my body changed, even as I started wearing my father's old work shirts under my dresses to flatten what was growing. I believed that what had happened was my fault, and that if I told anyone, the fault would be confirmed publicly and permanently. That belief, that single terrible belief, is what put me alone in a cornfield with a baby and no one to help me. Rebecca asked me who the father was. I told her. I watched something move across her face, not surprise, more like a door closing quietly behind a feeling she had decided not to let out. She had delivered babies in this district for decades. She knew Ezra's family. She knew his father. I understood in that moment, watching her face, that she was calculating something, measuring what was possible against what was safe for me, for herself, for the baby, lying quiet on my chest. She sat back on her heels and looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I cannot unsee this night. I cannot unlearn what I now know, but I can choose what I do with it." What followed was the longest conversation of my life. She told me plainly what my options were. She did not dress them up or soften them. She said I was 14 and had no milk yet, no means, and no way to raise this child within our community without destroying both our lives. She said she knew a couple, plain, quiet people, from a settlement in Indiana, who had been unable to have children of their own, and who she trusted completely. She said the baby would be loved. She said I would go home and recover, and in time, if I chose to leave the district, I could build a life that had room in it for everything this night had cost me. She said if I chose to keep the baby, she would not stop me. But I needed to understand what I would be walking into. I held my daughter against my chest, and I listened to every word. I thought about my father. I thought about the deacon. I thought about the way women were looked at in our district when they had given their bodies to sin, whether by choice or not, the distinction rarely mattering to anyone with the power to judge. I thought about my daughter growing up carrying a label she had done nothing to earn. I said, "Take her." Rebecca did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You can hold her until the sun comes up." I held her until the sun came up. I memorized her the way you memorize something you know you are about to lose, the curl of each finger, the small snoring sound she made when she finally slept, the exact temperature of the top of her head against my lips when I kissed her one last time, just as the sky went gold behind the stalks. I named her Miriam. I did not tell Rebecca why. The reason was private, just for me. Miriam in the scripture watched her baby brother from the reeds, kept vigil, refused to leave, and later she led the singing on the far bank when the water had finally parted. I wanted my daughter to be someone who kept vigil and then sang. I wanted her to outlast everything that had been done to us both. When Rebecca took her, I walked back across the pasture alone. I washed myself at the pump in the gray early light. I went inside and lay down and listened to my family begin their morning, my mother's footsteps, the creak of the kitchen fire being stoked, my younger sisters arguing over something small and ordinary, and I felt as though I was listening from underwater. No one ever asked where I had been. My mother noticed over the following weeks that I had grown thinner, that my appetite had come back, that the color had returned to my face, and she thanked God quietly that I had recovered from the prolonged sickness I had invented to explain away those 7 months. The women at church said I looked well. I smiled and agreed. Rebecca came to our house twice that winter, once for a birth down the road, once to check on my youngest brother who had a fever, and each time she met my eyes for exactly a moment, not long enough for anyone else to notice, long enough for me to know the secret was still being held. She never told. Not to the bishop, not to my parents, not, as far as I ever learned, to anyone. She also never reported Ezra, and that is the part of this I have lived with the longest and the hardest, the part that still wakes me at odd hours. I have tried to understand why. I think she was afraid. I think she knew that reporting him meant exposing me, meant the confession on my knees in front of the district, meant all the shame raining down on the wrong person the way it always did. I think she made a calculation that protecting me required protecting him, and I think she died not fully knowing whether that calculation had been right. I left the district when I was 19. I did not leave dramatically. I simply stopped coming home one Sunday, and kept not coming home until enough Sundays had passed that it became clear I was not coming back. I found work. I found a therapist years later in a room with the blinds drawn, and I told this story in that room for the first time. I searched for Miriam on and off for nearly a decade. The Indiana couple had moved, changed their surname, blended seamlessly into a plain community I could not fully access from the outside. I found nothing. I have made my peace with nothing. Rebecca died a few years ago. I drove back to Lancaster County for the funeral and sat in the back of the meeting house and listened to the bishop call her faithful and selfless, and a blessing to the women of the district, all of which was true, none of which was the whole truth. Afterward, I went to the cemetery and stood at the fresh mound of her grave, and I thought about what that word, faithful, actually means, who you are faithful to, at what cost, and whether the person you are protecting ever fully knows the weight of what is being carried on their behalf. I am telling this now because Rebecca is gone, and her silence went with her. And someone should say out loud what happened in that cornfield, not just to me, but to all the girls in all the districts who have done the same arithmetic I did, and concluded that disappearing was safer than speaking. The arithmetic is wrong. I know that now. I know that Ezra should have been stopped. I know that I should have been taken somewhere safe, somewhere with lights and doctors and people whose job it was to believe me. I know that the silence, however merciful it felt in the moment, cost me and cost Miriam and cost every girl Ezra hurt after I said nothing. Because there were others, I learned that later, from a woman who had grown up in his district in Ohio, who told me over the phone with a voice so flat and careful it almost sounded like she was reading from a document. Rebecca did the best she could from inside a system that was designed to keep women exactly where we were, small and quiet and full of secrets we had been taught were our own fault. I do not blame her. I also cannot fully forgive the silence. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I have stopped trying to resolve them. What I know is this: I was a child. I was hurt. I survived a night that should not have happened to any person at any age, alone in the dirt between rows of corn with no one coming and a baby who needed me to figure it out anyway. And I did figure it out. I am still figuring it out. I am Lavina, and I am still here.